I have grave concerns about the conservative governments. They go right away into implementing what they want to do. They don't wait. They don't try to appease public opinion. We've seen, for example, the CAC. Within a few months of being in government, they passed Bill 21. They're passing bills just like that. They don't try to lobby the population or try to look good. And this is a very dangerous issue, because to undo these damages that are done takes a lot of work and a lot of time. And it probably takes twice or three times the time period to undo the damage that they do.
So in terms of the context of the fear of this new conservative government coming in, for us, like, we're living already in the nightmare. So we won at the Supreme Court in 2013. It was a unanimous decision where the Supreme Court said that the laws were unconstitutional because they literally were killing us, were jeopardizing our safety, our health, and therefore could no longer exist. It was a conservative government at the time, so instead of listening to the Supreme Court, they used it as an opportunity to fully criminalize sex work for the first time in Canadian history, make laws that are a lot worse than previous laws. And so in 2015, when Liberals were elected, they were against this law when it passed. Just a year before, we expected that maybe there's a chance they would do something, but they didn't. Instead, for the past, almost 9 years now, they've been keeping us busy. They've been making us do a lot of work. We're back in court, and the Liberal government is fiercely defending these laws in front of the court, saying that we deserve to die if we commit crimes, going really willing to make legal arguments that are jeopardizing Morgentaler in the pursuit of saying we don't have autonomy over our body that lets us do sex work. So we're already in this dystopian nightmare with a Liberal government. And so the fear of this getting worse, it's even hard sometimes for us to imagine. But we see what's really clear is that there's a pattern that's already in action of even people that call themselves progressives, people who claim to support us, that are already preparing for this. And it's now the new excuse to not do anything.
So I think that almost every conversation I have now with different Indigenous leaders is, oh, you're planning on doing that in a year? How is that going to work out if we have a conservative government? So now we're sort of already thinking about plan Bs, because we have to keep moving forward. And I think there's been a lot of momentum in the Indigenous community. There's been a lot more organizations. There's like across Canada, like we're really, finding our footing and going forward. And I'm not interested in stopping in any ways.
Chris Alexander, towards the end of the Harper regime, was the Minister of Immigration, Refugees, etc. And he sort of went on this bandwagon. And if the Conservatives hadn't been thrown out, he probably would have succeeded in introducing legislation, what he calls zero tolerance for barbaric cultural practices. And again, these are euphemisms that target and construct non-white people in a very, very racialized way. So he invited a bunch of us, invited us at SAWCC, not knowing who we were, to a breakfast to talk about his campaign of zero barbaric practices, zero tolerance for barbaric practices. And we went to speak to him about a woman who was going to be deported to Egypt, right, who was in fear of her life. And we sort of, like, he was going around the table and, he thought we'd all behave very nicely and politely. And we said, well, wait a minute, like, you're talking about barbaric cultural practices, not that we buy into it, but you're ostensibly sending a woman back who has come here claiming gender violence. So what is that, right? So just very quickly trying to point out, the racialization and double standards. And now we're seeing with the situation in Palestine, how this Islamophobia has really, really snowballed to a point that Palestinians are completely dehumanized, right? The Liberal government has appointed Ms. Lyons and then Anthony Housefather. So you would think, and not to diminish the presence of anti-Semitism, right? But you would think that this was the greatest form of racism. And so, governments and politicians use their power and hegemony to put forward agendas. One last thing that I want to mention, there are so many horrible memories about the Conservatives in power at that time. When Idle No More happened at the end of 2012, and we had Cree youth marching in the cold winter from northern Quebec to Ottawa, and Teresa Spence was there on hunger strike because of the situation at Attawapiskat. Harper went to Toronto to greet two pandas that had been sent by China to the Toronto Zoo, and he was not in Ottawa to meet these young people. So, I mean, there was no pretense even of the absolute, lack of respect. So, I think I'm just going to pass it on now.
Thank you. Okay, so I think the example that I want to talk about is just to illustrate the amount of work that needs to be done. And especially when there's a sense of urgency, there's a temptation sometimes to just really want to organize as fast as possible. But when we have governments that don't care about our collective voices and are happy to just cherry pick individuals as experts and try to break us up, well, it's the moment where it's important to have collective discourse that is coherent and that everyone can use and understand. So for sex workers in Canada, when we were faced with these new laws, obviously the first thing that we had to do was just educate everyone on, when are we going to get arrested and for what, and, those basic things. But once that first emergency was done, we got together with all of the groups from the Canadian Alliance for Sex Work Law Reform, which is about 25 groups across Canada, primarily by and for sex workers. And we came to the conclusion that for decades we were screaming decriminalization everywhere, but we hadn't actually articulated what does that mean? What's the bill that we need passed at this stage? So we took about 18 months where we consulted all the groups across Canada. We did several meetings with a smaller committee of representatives from different groups to educate ourselves on what is possible within the law, how does the Constitution work, how do certain other types of provincial law work, all of those topics that we had identified that we needed to know in order to articulate law reform. And then from there, we were able to start elaborating the values that are required for law reform that respects sex workers' rights, and then go over every section of the criminal code one by one and make a decision about all of them. So the conclusion was somewhat similar to what we had always been saying: decriminalization, remove sex work from the criminal code. But now we have about an 80-page document that details exactly what that is, that gives us guidelines of this is okay, this is not okay. That goes over, once we remove it from the criminal code, where does it go in the provincial jurisdictions? What does it mean for labor rights? What does it mean for occupational health and safety? What are all the ways that once we remove police, that other forms of institutions can come and ruin our lives in different ways? So we were able to do all of this very slowly, very carefully. It did raise some disagreements in our community. We had a huge, several month-long debate over all the groups about certain positions that for some of us were super obvious and other groups had not really thought about in the same way. We were able to also resolve within our movement some issues such as some general anti-Asian sentiment within sex worker groups, because it's really easy for a lot of sex workers to say, oh yeah, those Asian women, they must all be trafficked, send the cops after them, not me. And so we were able to actually take that head on and address it and look at all of the other segments of our community and then make sure that we have demands that meet everyone's needs. And so then we published this document, and since then we've been using this. So every time there's a call to testify in front of a committee, every time there's a brief that can be written, we have this document that becomes the way that we can speak collectively. So when they say, oh, we don't want to hear from you as a group, I'm going to call some random academic, we can tell that academic, well, that's the document. That's what you need to say, and that's it. And so I think that we need that type of work. In our case, we were so lucky that we had funding from Open Societies Foundations to do this at the time that they still cared about Canada and sex workers. They have now pulled out of all sex worker funding all over the world because they think we're a lost cause. But it cost us about $100,000 to do this over about 18 months. And that's why our movement is strong and can keep going. And so obviously it's not realistic to do that with every question, but that methodology of accountability, of actually educating ourselves really thoroughly, of identifying who in our community has that knowledge and can share it with others, making it accessible, that's how we can have sustainable movements. So I just wanted to give that example to just remind us that we can't just forget about that in the rush to respond to something really bad. That we need people organizing a protest, and we need people reading legal documents very carefully and producing workshops and training everyone so that we can have that collective message.
Oui, on a essayé de créer des partenariats avec plusieurs. Justement, on fait partie de l'Alliance canadienne des travailleurs du sexe au niveau du pays. Et nous avons aussi d'autres partenariats avec des organismes qui luttent pour les droits des personnes migrantes, marginales. Et nous avons créé un lien avec un groupe qui s'appelle Agir, qui travaille beaucoup avec les personnes migrantes et de la communauté LGBTQ+. Et puis, on a Stella comme partenaire. Moi, personnellement, je suis aussi dans le conseil d'administration de Stella. On est très militante vis-à-vis de tous les droits de tous sortes parce que notre drapeau couvre beaucoup des enjeux, pas seulement les enjeux vis-à-vis la population, je pourrais dire blanche, aussi comme la population autre que la population, je ne sais pas si on peut faire le lien des personnes marginales attendez, je me suis en train de perdre un peu, mais sinon, moi, personnellement, je me suis toujours prêté, et c'est pour moi très important de participer à tout ce qui représente la lutte, les combats contre l'impact que nous avons pour la violence chez les personnes trans. Donc, la violence que je vois parmi mes participantes, c'est aussi l'harcèlement, c'est la violence verbale surtout. Alors, on cherche à avoir des espaces de sécurité, on cherche à avoir les soins. Parce qu'en ayant la population migrante, quand ils arrivent, ils font la demande auprès du gouvernement fédéral. C'est le fédéral qui couvre leurs frais de soins santé. Donc, pendant la pandémie, les soins santé a été une des premières enjeux d'ASTT vis-à-vis la demande. Alors, on a eu beaucoup de demandes et l'offre n'était pas si forte pour pouvoir envoyer référer nos participantes pour les soins santé. Donc, les soins santé, l'espace sécuritaire, l'habitation, les logements. Moi, personnellement, j'accompagne beaucoup les gens qui moi-même, c'est très personnel puisque j'étais au début de la pandémie en éviction de mon appartement. Je me suis battu et j'accompagne mes participants que les propriétaires pensent que parce qu'ils viennent d'arriver, ils ne connaissent pas la loi, qu'ils vont se faire mettre dehors, et se faire discriminer sans aucun support et appui. Alors, grâce à notre appui, ils se parlent, c'est des bouche-oreille souvent quand ils viennent nous voir. Et on est très content toujours de les appuyer par rapport à l'immigration. Comme je dis, c'est très fort, un enjeu très fort à ASTT pour la réduction des méfaits, pour tout ce que je vous dis, les accompagnements. Alors, la lutte qu'ASTT envoie aussi, c'est par rapport au travail du sexe, parce que nous sommes là aussi pour les travailleuses du sexe trans, et nous savons que les personnes trans sont beaucoup pénalisées, puisque si une personne qui est ici à titre de demandeur d'asile, puis il ou elle est trouvé à faire le travail du sexe, ils sont automatiquement exclus de pouvoir se procurer une résidence au pays. Donc, on essaie d'accompagner et de faire en sorte que ces gens sont défendus, qu'on fait la défense de tous ces droits. Donc voilà, j'essaie de penser parmi tous mes accompagnements, tout ce que je touche, et l'emploi. L'emploi aussi, on est très portant à aider ces monde qui nous demandent par la discrimination à l'emploi et les accompagner vis-à-vis les droits de leur nombre de travail, tout ça. Donc voilà, ça c'est un peu ce qu'on fait pour la lutte contre qu'est-ce qui arrive présentement avec le gouvernement que nous avons. Mais c'est sûr que vis-à-vis le gouvernement provincial, ça c'est un autre côté, mais le fédéral, et on a la peur qui vient nous couper aussi des subventions ou n'importe quoi qu'on puisse avoir, à cause qu'on sait très bien que si le gouvernement conservateur prend la relève, ça va être l'économie qui vont prendre comme drapeau pour défendre les coûts. On risque à l'austérité vis-à-vis la population trans. Donc,
You know, the AFN was here, right? And I was like, oh, I want to go see the AFN. And it was like $850 to get in. I was like, what? So anyways, I sneaked in, you know, and when Pierre was there, like part of the chiefs like turned their back on him. But some still gave him a blanket. I'm like, I don't know. I don't get it. I don't understand. Because we're all so varied, we have to try to find some kind of commonality, and that's going to be the challenge. And that's all I've got to say about that. Thank you for listening.
Regarding organizing for trans people, ASTT has been part of the Trans March since almost the beginning. I wasn't there when Harper was in the government, and we got a deadline with a grant that we got for a couple of years, and it was finished by 2023, I believe. Yes. So when I got to work in ASTT, I got a little bit of the money that to work with that money that we had, and we did a lot. We were paying for almost everything for our people. Now the government, well, that's Quebec, but we don't pay for certain stuff. But when it comes to organize, fight for our rights, we are there. ASTT is there. If we hear the coalition ask us to, since we get to know each other today and we get to know our issues, every issue from different organizations, we all support each other. I think we will be I am willing to organize my people, of course. And I will talk with ATQ, Agir, in case we need more support. And also we need support from the whole country together. So we're gonna try to get a whole other organizations within the country to accompany us to fight and combat our rights. So because ASTT is here to stay and the immigration is not stopping, and we need to organize to keep working for them and to keep helping to fight discrimination and stigma for all kind of stuff that stick to trans people. We work with people homeless, we work with people HIV as well. We, thank goodness, because we find a doctor for them, for the migrants and for the rest of the population as well. But before they even were allowed to apply to come to this country. So now we have that opportunity to offer them a better life here, and we want to keep fighting for their rights.
So I really like what was said before about the solidarity that has to go both ways and that has to be a bit more present sometimes. And I think that's our solution when things get really bad. It's really important to not stay within just our small communities and our priorities, but it's the moment where we need to reach out and hear what other people are struggling with, because ultimately it's all the same system. It's all the same reasons, and when we're able to take those steps back and see the bigger picture of what's happening to our communities and to other communities, that's, I find, when we're able to actually find ways to organize that can actually lead to something and that are not necessarily obvious. It's really easy when there's a specific policy that's affecting us to mobilize around that, but sometimes there's maybe other things that if we look at it together, we might find something else to do. An example that I really appreciated and that comes up a lot, people talk about this to me a lot, was about, like, I think it was in 2018 at the Fédération des Femmes du Québec, the FFQ, which is the Quebec's feminist movement, which is, you know, full of like this idea of big tent of feminism, which means that let's just have positions that favor the majority and ask everyone else to just be in solidarity and put our needs aside. And it just so happened that the same year there were debates around sex work and around Bill 21 and all of its different iterations. And we were able to get this institution to take positions that made sense on sex work and on Muslim women, because we were able to be in solidarity and make it coherent and say, well, it's the same exact issue. In terms of feminist thinking, it's the same question that we are answering. It's two different topics, but that same hatred is applied to many, many, many people. And if we're able to see those things, then that's when that solidarity can happen. But it's also important to, while we can be in solidarity with people who are affected by something, that doesn't mean that we need to accept and cooperate with people who hate us and people who don't want to recognize us. And when we start to put up those boundaries and start to say, like, no, if this union wants me dead, then I'm not going to show up to their thing, even if it could benefit me in some way, even if I'm in solidarity with their workers, then that's when things also can change within our movement. And then the other thing for organizing that I want to talk about that's just really like tedious and the worst is the fact that we do have to have people who interact within the system. We do have to have people who go and talk to the government in different ways when we all want to say, absolutely not, we're not going to go to the meeting, we're not going to sit at the table. We know some people are doing it. We know there are some instances that keep running even under a conservative government. There's some boards that still have an impact. There's some consultations that still exist. And so a priority, I think, in organizing in the next year is to make sure we map out all those places where people will have some sort of power, even small. Find out who's actually interested in doing this, because there are people who do this, and making sure that they're in touch, that they're accountable, that we're providing them with what we need, and that we prioritize that. Even if the majority of our communities, Stella, I'm the one who has to go do this work sometimes and sit in meetings where I just want to flip the table and strangle everyone. But I have to go and I have to say what you know our community needs, and it's an honor and a privilege to be delegated to do this, but it's the most violent type of work. So we need to think now, who are we sending? How do they get in? How do we build up people's legitimacy to be representatives of our community? And how do we make sure that the opportunistic people in our community who will go and take those spots when we don't want them anymore, who will go and speak for us, that we don't let them get away with it? Because that's what's going to happen also when there's that shift of government. We know that everyone who wants for their own career, for their own, everyone will show up and claim all kinds of stuff, claim that they, worked in whatever community, or that, like, whatever claim that they will have, claim to be speaking for other people. And it's really easy to get away with it when there's no one else there to say no, or no one else willing to take that spot. So that's, I really empathize with the perspective that we just shouldn't, and we should say no and not do this. Sometimes there's a limit, but I think that's a big question that we need to face and think about.
Yeah, so following along what Sandra was saying, definitely, various communities and others have said this evening, various communities coming together, we all do like very specific work, but we share common concerns about our communities, the well-being of our communities, and how governments seek to isolate us and kind of use dog whistle politics. So, I just want to come back to that point I made earlier during the Harper years about the honor crimes and the forced marriage and barbaric cultural practices. By the way, because of Harper, since that time, in the citizenship exam prep book, there's a statement that Canada, we do not tolerate honor crimes. Please know that if you're becoming a citizen. And it's there in the multiple choice citizenship test. So they've kind of put it there, they've planted this sort of notion about honor crimes. But what we were trying to do at that time was point out that we already have legislation about violence against women, for example. We already have laws to protect children. So by sort of trotting out honor crimes and forced marriage, you were kind of practicing a kind of dog whistle politics, low-hanging fruit where people would say, but also pointing out that it's these same conservative politicians and ideologues who push for, against rights to abortion, bodily sovereignty for women, and pointing out that, okay, you might think, okay, those poor brown people and those women have to be protected, but what about you from the majority community? So sort of pointing out that there is a kind of ideological, in this case, kind of misogynistic idea that's there, and it impacts all women. So sort of the commonality. And on that point of all women, one of the things I really, really regret no longer existed, and of course, there are federations, as we know, that bring together all kinds of people and not necessarily all happy campers, but the absence of a cross-Canada women's organization. There was no NAC, and he was just doing everything and there was no voice. And this would be very, very important. I know in the last couple of years there's an attempt that started out of Ontario to have a cross-Canada network of racialized and marginalized women, OCASI. What I heard now, the funding went, and so the person who was heading it up is no longer doing it. But I would like us, for example, to keep that network alive, because we're going to need these networks again. I mean, in Quebec, as Sandra said, we have the Fédération des Femmes du Québec, which is very problematic in many ways, but at least it is there, and we can call on it to speak, and when it speaks, it's known as the Fédération, it's attacked, etc. But it's there, and it's important to have these voices.
I think we were caught off guard with how the CAC started and how it went full-fledged into the many things that you mentioned. And I think that the positive side is that I think everybody is extremely aware. I know about discussions and brainstorming that's going on in many places about how are we going to deal with Pierre Poilievre. Again, when he comes, unfortunately, many people don't see it as if he comes. And that is the strength and the advantage in having this kind of discussion, this kind of exchange is what will lead us, hopefully, to do much better against Pierre Poilievre than we managed to do against the CAC.
One other thing that happens when governments like CAC come into power is that a lot of the bureaucrats that are not elected are very upset about that, and they become allies in certain ways. So it's really important to not discount the power that these people have. One example in Quebec under CAC that somehow we were able to keep moving was the reforms for EVAC, the help for victims of crime. So obviously a government like CAC, they're all about like law and order, and like, so they can't explicitly be against helping victims of crime. So they didn't stop it, but the work was done primarily by various bureaucrats who did reach out to community. I got a call multiple times under CAC by people at the Ministry of Justice in Quebec who were telling me, oh, I'm working on this thing and I see an opportunity. Do you want to hear me out? And having these not secret conversations, but just conversations that are under the political level, but that impact then how the policy is written. And hateful governments have a lot of political will and power and tend to be really competent in like enacting the policies that they want, but they also are focused on certain issues and don't always have time to police everything that's happening. So we were able with EVAC to get some like actually meaningful changes, and we're seeing now, and it's been about 3 years since the law changed and all kinds of policy change, and we're actually seeing in action women in our community that are getting compensated for things that had been refused before, that are there's a lot of those things. It's not a perfect system by any means, but we were able to do that by talking to bureaucrats, there's other examples as well. So I think federally the same kind of thing can apply, that there's some people who stay regardless of who the government is, and if it's possible to understand how those systems work, it goes back to just having enough information to know where the power is, and that's how we have to get really granular in our organizing